Hello and welcome to Future Squared. Stephen Hawking once said that intelligence is the ability to adapt to change, so let's adapt. My name is Steve Glaveski, and each week I'll bring you conversations with preeminent thought leaders from a variety of fields to help you think in a multidisciplinary way, keep goals in your professional and personal life, and better navigate what is fast becoming a brave, new world. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation accelerator that works with organizations to unlock their people's latent potential to create more impact for humanity and lead more fulfilling lives. If you need help driving your organization's innovation strategy, visit collectivecampus.io. And without further ado,
come with me if you want to live.
Where often people think because they're doing something innovative, results don't matter, and that is totally wrong. This is one of my co-author from Dual Transformation, Clark Gilbert's. This is one of his biggest pieces. You know, he actually drove dual transformation at a newspaper company and then at a university. And one of his demands is that the people working on the B side of the equation, the new growth side of the equation, they have to deliver results because there's so much institutional skepticism that if they do not deliver results, they just have all the ammunition to kill them. So what he suggests that people do is be modest in your expectations in the early days and then over-deliver.
welcome back to Future Squared for episode number 292 with Scott Anthony. Scott Anthony is the managing partner at Innosight. In his time with Innosight, Scott has advised senior leaders in companies such as Procter Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, SingTel, Kraft, General Electric, LG, the Ayala Group and Cisco Systems on topics of growth and innovation. He also has extensive experience in emerging markets, particularly in India, China and the Philippines. Scott's new book is called Dual Transformation: How to Reposition Today's Business While Creating the Future. And his previous efforts include Seeing What's Next, The Innovator's Guide to Growth, The Silver Lining, The Little Black Book of Innovation, and Building a Growth Factory. He has authored or co-authored numerous articles on innovation and strategy and regularly contributes to the Harvard Business Review website. Scott is also a featured speaker on topics of innovation and growth. He has delivered keynote addresses on 5 continents and has appeared on Good Morning America, Channel News Asia, CNBC, and Fox Business. Prior to joining Innosight, Scott was a senior researcher with Clayton Christensen, managing a group that worked to further Christensen's research on innovation. I went on a bit of an expedition in my conversation with Scott, looking to bust many of the widely held myths that are often inhibiting and sabotaging the innovation efforts of large organizations across the world. We explored myriad topics, including 1. Why conflating ideas with innovation is wrong. 2. How to overcome the inertia that plagues most large organizations. And 3. What to do if your organization just doesn't want to play ball. And Scott also recounts a delightful story featuring none other than his 7-year-old son, which teaches us a valuable lesson on how our environment can shape our behavior. With that, it gives me much pleasure to bring you one of the most preeminent names in the innovation landscape today, Scott Anthony. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Thanks for having me, Steve. Delighted to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the program, and you're joining me all the way from sunny Singapore, where I understand you've got the tough gig of looking over Marina Bay Sands.
Yeah, it's not sunny at the moment, unfortunately, but we do have a nice view of the Singaporean skyline here. And when the sun is shining, it is quite a spectacular view, hopefully later today.
It is indeed spectacular. And I was lucky enough to catch you speak at Innovators, the conference in Sydney just last month. While you were in town, did you get much opportunity to do a little bit of exploring, or was it purely business?
No, this one was in and outer. So I actually landed on a red eye that morning, went to the Innovators conference, and then went straight back to the airport. Those are always sad trips when you do it, but I've been fortunate to spend enough time down in Sydney, Melbourne, and other parts of Australia that I have had a chance to visit, not on this trip, though.
Yep, fair enough. And I absolutely love those in and out trips. And for those of us who perhaps haven't done the Singapore to Melbourne trip, for those of you listening from Europe and the US, that is about 7 or so hours. So flying in and flying out, it's quite the effort. So Well played, well played. But Scott, you've been in the corporate innovation space for about 2 decades now, kicking off with managing a group of Harvard researchers back in 2001, which furthered Clayton Christensen's work in the space. You've been at Innosight now for almost 2 decades, where you're the MD of the Asia Pac practice. I'd love to just go back in time for a second and find out what first got you interested in working in the space of corporate innovation.
Yeah, so I remember the moment distinctly. So it was my second year when I was in business school. This is the fall of 2000. And like many people at that point, I was 25 years old. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. It was a tumultuous time in the global economy. The dot-com bubble had just burst. And I'm sitting in a classroom, and in ambles Clayton Christensen. And he did something that was really iconoclastic. You know, most people go and lecture or they use PowerPoint slides or whatever. He actually had acetates, overhead slides that he put up and talked for about half an hour, which most business school professors didn't do. And I just remember at that moment, I intellectually fell in love with the ideas that Christensen had been working on. That was the spark, and as I studied under him and began to read some of his work, I thought there was just a really interesting stream of things that he and like-minded researchers had done. And the more time I spent, the more attached to the ideas I became. So that's the beginning of the story way back in 2000.
Fantastic. And I mean, the middle of the story, if I could call it that, was you moving to Singapore back in 2010. Now, as I understand it, you were moving to Singapore ultimately to get out of consulting at the time, but things didn't quite go as planned. What happened?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So when I moved out here in 2010, the reason I moved out here wasn't to expand the consulting practice that I helped to build in North America to Southeast Asia. It was to leave that behind and join a sister company that we had set up called Innosight Ventures, which invested in and incubated startup companies. And the theory was I wanted to go to where the impact was, and that's where you have impact, right? Working with small emerging startup companies. Well, in the end of 2010, just about 8 years ago to this date, I had a paired set of experiences that showed me I had actually framed the problem incorrectly, that there actually is great nobility and huge impact from working with large established organizations. And I won't go through all the details, but the basic point was it showed me that while it never has been easier to start a business, that makes it paradoxically really hard to scale one, is you have to fight as a startup against all these copycats. And the large companies that can figure out how to leverage assets at scale and take advantage of the same things that make it so easy for entrepreneurs to start things up, those are the ones that really can have market-changing impact. Difficult to do, of course, but it really showed me that there is great goodness in working with Goliath, not necessarily the Davids that are trying to take them down.
Yeah, I couldn't have put it better myself. And I mean, on working with Goliath, I mean, you're talking about leveraging some of the unique advantages that large companies have, such as brand, reputation, domain expertise, networks, resources, assets, and so on, that startups generally, especially in the early stages, won't have access to. But just on that point, David versus Goliath, I mean, is there any merit? And we've seen obviously the proliferation of corporate startup accelerator programs over the last 5 to 10 years, but is there any merit then in combining the domain expertise, assets, networks, resources of your Goliath with some of the talent and tech and speed that you see coming out of the startup ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, one of the most persistent findings in the innovation literature is that magic happens at intersections when different mindsets, skills, and backgrounds collide together. And what you're talking about, Steve, that's a very clear intersection where you've got the assets and scale of the established companies with the energy and enthusiasm of the entrepreneurs. And I think finding ways to have each side learn from each other and get better because of each other allows each to do things that on their own they could not do. Yeah, of course, a startup company will always be faster than an established company. It will always be more nimble than an established company. It has to be. But the big company has things that the startup company doesn't. So you find ways to marry those together without crushing either side of the equation. That's when I think you can do some really special things. Again, this is a lot easier said. I think we all know this. It's a lot easier said than done. But when it is done, it's really powerful.
Yeah, and aligning the way of working, the values and systems rather of a large organization with the character attributes that underpin, say, an entrepreneur or someone heading up a small business or a startup rather, who is looking to move at at pace. And every time they want to try and do something, they're speaking with an organization who wants to call a steering committee meeting, and they're not going to hear back from them for 4 weeks. Obviously, that is not how you get meaningful outcomes from those relationships. There really needs to be a way of working that brings both parties together, and also alignment between, say, the large organization's strategic objectives and business model alignment, and also the people behind both parties just need to be able to have some form of a cohesive relationship. Otherwise, it can ultimately end for naught if they don't iron those things out up front.
Absolutely. This is one of the big themes of my latest book. Came out about 18 months ago, called Dual Transformation. And the basic idea of the book is when disruption strikes, if you're a large established organization, you need to transform, fundamental change in form or substance. And it's not a single thing you do, it's two. Transformation A is repositioning today's business. Transformation B is creating tomorrow's business. A lot of the entrepreneurial activities, of course, are going to be part of Transformation B. And there are new rules, new metrics, new mindsets that you have to follow when you go and do it. And in fact, new organizational designs as well, where if you don't do it, you'll just never get there. You'll move too slowly. The committee meetings will drag you down, and on and on and on. And that is the answer for organizations that sometimes feel overwhelmed by this. They say, well, I'm a big company. I can't do this. I can't be agile at scale. You say, well, you don't necessarily have to be if you figure out how to separate the problem. Now, I should say being agile at scale is still a good thing to aspire to, but at least in the interim, separating the problem can help you get there more quickly.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, on those two transformations, Transformation A and Transformation B, on unlocking that latent potential and helping organizations embrace, for example, Transformation B. I mean, one of the stories you told at your talk in Sydney really resonated with me, and it was around organizations who are looking for the quick fix. And in my personal experience, we often speak with organizations and urge them to, if they're early on in their innovation journey, run something like an innovation assessment. So you get take the pulse of the organization, understand what their current policies, processes, values, systems, metrics, and so on are, and identify the gaps, like where are the innovation blockers, and put in place some sort of prioritized recommendations in terms of starting to plug those gaps. And firstly and foremost, build an environment that's going to support innovation. But oftentimes that's just too hard. And you told the story of a creative agency that ran something along the lines of a Superhero Friday. Mr. Innovation and Mrs. Innovation, rather than actually taking the time and effort to transform that underlying environment to one that will support the behaviors that underpin innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. So innovation is not a quick fix. It's not something that you can snap your fingers and make happen. If you're trying to do anything at scale, you're looking at a deep system level issue, and a system level issue demands a system level response. And the story you referenced, it was one of our clients a dozen years ago where we told them that. We said they needed to intervene at a systematic level, doing all the things you talked about to move the needle, and they were impatient. So they got rid of us, hired somebody else who suggested, as you said, that everyone in the senior leadership team dress up in spandex as a superhero to show the organization it was a new day when it comes to innovation. We've all been through things like this. You laugh when you see it. And the only thing this company's happy about today, because of course this had absolutely no impact, is it was before the era of the ubiquitous camera phone. So there's no photographic proof that the senior executives made fools of themselves. And that's what they did, and everybody laughed at them, and it had no impact. The other thing related to this is when people say, okay, we're going to start working on innovation, so we need an idea that's going to produce $1 billion or some ridiculous number next year. The only way you're ever going to do that is through acquisition. And the only way you're ever going to do anything that big is if you acquire someone that has already proven its business and business model, and it will be perfectly priced. So what are you going to do? You're not going to create any unique growth doing that. When you set the hurdle that high, you inevitably point yourself at established markets that have large competitors, and those actually aren't that interesting markets. So both sides of the equation, the short answer is there is no short answer. If you're looking for the silver bullet, if you're looking for the quick fix, you need to look somewhere else.
Yeah, and I couldn't help but laugh when you told that story, because one of my own experiences with something very similar was at one of the big four accounting firms who shall remain unnamed, and what they put into place was a dress like a startup Friday. So take out your best hoodie and your pair of Chuck Taylors, and that's going to help us move the needle.
And, look, I don't think there's anything wrong with having that as a piece of an integrated program. But, the thing that just drives you crazy is when you have people who try to do the snap your finger silver bullet sort of thing. Sometimes it's dressed like a startup. Sometimes it's let's have free thinking Friday or wacky idea Wednesday or heaven forbid special purpose Saturday. And they think this is it. And this will move the needle. It doesn't. This is, we call it innovation propaganda or Innoganda. Innovation theater is another name that gets used for it. And that's exactly what it is. And leaders who have not been through this before, they might get a little burst of energy from it, but usually the troops who've seen this come and go, they're really cynical when they see this. They know exactly what's going on, and they'll play the game because they need to, but behind the backs of the leaders, they're making fun of them, and that's not what any leader wants, right?
Well, definitely. And I mean, would you say there's a big risk of undertaking such initiatives, but then like you pointed out, some of your more entrepreneurial employees, people who've been there, done that in other organizations, may become a little bit disgruntled at the lack of genuine effort to shift the culture? And it seems to me that a lot of organizations who are perhaps in the early days of their innovation journey tend to conflate ideas with innovation rather than looking at the ability to execute on those ideas.
No, absolutely. One of the most painful reminders that I had of this, I was with my family a couple years ago in Cambodia, and we were visiting a silkworm farm where they went and harvest the silkworms. They got the silk from them, turned it into garments, sold it to tourists like us. And it actually was quite an inspiring business. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of Cambodians that would otherwise be unemployed that were put to work, and they produced great stuff, etc. Anyway, we were walking around and we saw this blue box called the Ideas Box. And the Ideas Box said, this is for you, for your colleagues, for your well-being. And you're feeling really good until you look at the Ideas Box and you see that not only does it have a lock on it, the lock is rusty, which means it has never, ever, ever been opened. And that's a metaphor for what we do in many organizations. When we conflate innovation with the development of ideas rather than something different that creates value, then we create the equivalent of the lockbox where ideas go into to die. And you're absolutely right. Your truly innovative talent, your entrepreneurial talent that might be frustrated with business as usual anyway, when they see this, it's their sign that it's time to go because they know that you're never going to move to actually have impact.
Yeah. And I mean, on this point of coming up with ideas but not executing on them and not having a process to execute, should large organizations perhaps be taking some guidance or some lessons out of the world of venture capital, whereby a venture capital firm may invest or may meet with 2,000 startups a year, of which they tend to invest in maybe 20, and of those 20, 2 might be home runs. I mean, in terms of starting to replicate that philosophy of taking lots of small bets, and those bets could be as small as, say, $100 experiment in a large organization, and then applying some form of metered funding to that, as a VC does from seed round to Series A to B to C to D and so on. Does it make sense for organizations to start to explore that over your glorified, say, idea challenge that runs for 2 weeks a year?
My answer to this, Steve, would be a yes, but. So I think absolutely the precepts of venture capital where you go and invest a little, learn a lot, and you recognize that ideas are going to change. And in many cases, you're picking people over picking the specific ideas because the people can weather the pivots, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Absolutely true. The only small exception that we suggest in a corporate context is don't start with a mindset of we're just going to explore randomness. We're going to have thousands of flowers bloom. Rather, we do suggest that you take the time to map out your what we call strategic opportunity areas. You could call them corporate moonshots, whatever. What are the big areas you're going to explore? What are the big platforms you want to compete in? Then once you define the big playing areas, then absolutely you need a lot of micro experiments within those areas. Just like when John F. Kennedy said, we're going to send a man to the moon and bring him back by the end of the decade, he said, we don't know what kind of long-lived rocket technology is going to work, so we're going to very consciously experiment with a bunch of different things. So you've got a bold, inspiring vision, you've made a where-to-play choice, but then the how-to-win option are emergent that come from trial and error experimentation. Now, I'd make a broader point, too. One of the things that drives, I think, all of us in the field a little bit crazy is it's not like the idea of borrowing from venture capital is a brand spanking new idea. It's not like the idea of listening to your customers to find out their needs and experiment. I mean, this is not radical stuff. This is actually well-documented, well-grounded, well-detailed stuff that any organization can do if they just do it with discipline. So again, it's the looking for the quick fix that stops people from having success. It's not like there aren't answers to these things. There are really good answers out there. You just have to do it with discipline.
Yeah, and I mean, how much of that is a reflection of people perhaps not wanting to do the work? And I mean, the question I really have for you, Scott, is, I mean, how important is getting the right people on the bus to begin with? Because the methodologies are there. There's countless, journals out there, books and whatnot on the topic, case studies on how companies are trying to navigate the increase in volatility and uncertainty in the current business landscape. But it seems as if certain people just don't want to do the work or are looking for the quick fix versus taking the time to get it right. And I mean, how much of that also comes back to the fact that a lot of people in a large organization perhaps only have a 1 to 3 year horizon and then they're looking to move on.
No, absolutely. As the great poet Bob Dylan said, if you don't have nothing, you've got nothing to lose, right? So those who have a lot to lose, loss aversion and other sorts of things, very naturally are conservative when it comes to doing new things. So I think absolutely people are paramount as you think about what it takes to succeed with innovation. Just as one example, when we did some research tied to digital transformation, we were looking for large organizations that had done the best job of fundamentally changing themselves over the past decade. And we published this in a research report called the Transformation 10. And one of the interesting findings was there were essentially two types of CEOs that you found on the Transformation 10. There were people like Jeff Bezos, who were the founders of their organizations and therefore had great degrees of autonomy. But then the professional managers had a particular pattern where they were what we called insider-outsiders. So insiders in that they knew the company, they knew the industry. Outsiders in that they had some kind of diversifying experience that allowed them to look at the world in a different way. As an example of this, Satya Nadella for Microsoft. He is a Microsoft lifer, so he knows Microsoft, but his formative experience is on the cloud. So he's going to come not with an office-based perspective, but a cloud-based perspective. And that, I think, has really helped him as he's driven quite a dramatic transformation at Microsoft. Or if you look regionally, if you look at DBS, the largest bank in Singapore, its CEO, Piyush Gupta, he is a banker. He spent time at Citibank. He has lots of banking experience, but he also had experience at a startup during the dot-com period. So he had the combination of knowing the industry, but being a little bit apart from it, which I think has allowed him to lead DBS in a very different direction. So people matter a ton, no doubt.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there was some research that came out of the University of Sydney recently called Red Brain, Blue Brain, Evaluative Processes Differ in Democrats and Republicans. And it just talked about how neurologically certain people are wired to be a little bit more predisposed towards taking risks, whereas others aren't. And I guess this shows up in large organizations where people, you may have people who fall into the bucket of do what's always been done, don't shake the tree, and then people who want to challenge the status quo and want to enter uncharted territories. Now, within an organization, like I said, you're going to have both personalities. I mean, how have you seen this play out in your work, Scott, and how do you see people overcome some of those challenges?
Yeah, it's a great question. I haven't seen that research, but I'll look at it right after we're done with this interview because that's interesting research. So I'd make a couple of comments. So the first comment, I'll make three. First comment, absolutely, this is consistent with our field experience, no doubt, that you have people who have certain biases, not biases in terms of race, gender, or whatever, but biases in terms of how they approach problems. Those that like to get data versus those that like to experiment their way to success. So you will definitely see that. The second observation I would make is sometimes you will be surprised because sometimes you will think that a function will correlate with a bias. So someone in procurement or somebody who's in finance, they will tend to be more data-driven and analytical. And maybe they will on average, but you also will see people, if you lift them out of the day-to-day and say, okay, let's go and try some different things, you will see amazing innovative thinking from places where you don't expect it. Maybe because they've got the muscle there and it just hasn't been used and they're frustrated, which gets to my third and final comment. I am a believer that we are all human beings. That's not a radical statement, right? But all human beings enter the world in the natural state. They're curious and creative. So I think that's inside of everybody. I think it is often constrained and held back by the context in which people sit, which means you can unleash the inner innovator if you give people the space, if you give people the chance to go and do it, if you give them some training and you give them some tools. Of course, some will go to it more naturally, but I believe anybody can get good at this with conscious practice. Will that make them Elon Musk or Steve Jobs? Of course not. But will that make them someone who can be much better than a novice? I think absolutely.
And curiosity, I mean, that's one of the 4 C's you identified as key character attributes that underpin your corporate innovators, the others being courage, clarity, and conviction.
No, absolutely. And I think of all of those things, I think the leader needs to have the courage, because by the time the data is clear that you need to do something, the game has already changed. So a leader who's trying to reinvent his or her organization has to act without pure convincing data. It's a courageous thing for a leader to do. Organizations need curiosity. So if I were to pick out 2 of those things as being most critical, it is courage on the point of the leader. We use in the book the example of Mark Bertolini, the CEO of Aetna, a big U.S.-based health insurance company that started to transform his business right after earning record revenues and record profits, which is paradoxically the best time to do it, even if it doesn't feel like you need to do it. So leaders need that, and organizations, institutions need curiosity.
Yeah, and I guess if you are a courageous leader who, despite double-digit revenue growth, decides to transform the business, you ultimately need to be able to tell a good story that shareholders believe in if you are a listed company. I mean, if you look at the likes of Netflix, Tesla, Amazon, despite for so long not recording profits in many of those companies' cases, they were still able to grow quite quickly, especially insofar as their share price was concerned, because people believed in the vision based on the metrics of success that weren't earnings per share related, but were around, hey, here's our move from selling books to cloud infrastructure. Here's our move from selling DVDs to streaming films online. So people actually believed in the vision. How important is selling that vision if you are to be a courageous leader?
Absolute imperative. I would say 2 things about this. You need to have 2 things. Number one, you need the story, you need the vision, and it needs to be a story. A story does not necessarily involve having very specific numbers. You might choose to have them if you want to have them, but you need a narrative. You need something that people can say, wow, I'm inspired by that. I understand the picture that you're painting. It might be the metaphor we like to use. It might be an impressionist painting because it's future facing. You don't exactly know, but you're at least doing something that goes beyond our return on invested capital will be 12.23%. You need a living, breathing heart as you go to do that. That's point number one. Point number 2, you need the demonstration points. You need the proof points. You need the signposts along the way that show that you're moving in the right direction. Trust me, is just not something that you can sell. It's I have shown, and this is what you'll see. That's what can be sold. And this isn't, again, stuff that's just done by the iconic leaders of the companies you mentioned, Reed Hastings and Netflix and Elon Musk and Tesla, et cetera. This is also done by people like Mark Bertolini at Aetna, who, as he is transforming his insurance company, he comes up with a story, along with his team, of course, about what the future organization will look like, and has signposts along the way, and manages as a publicly listed company to take his shareholders along a journey that ultimately results in it merging with CVS Caremark, a big pharmacy retailer in the United States, to create a really different type of healthcare company. So this is not just a game for startups. This is something that big, established, dare I say, boring companies can do as well.
Yeah, and to echo those sentiments, I mean, it's not just a game for leaders within large organizations too. I mean, if you are a little bit further down the ranks, but you want to explore an idea of yours rather than presenting trailing indicators and financial metrics, here's our projected, net present value and things of that sort. What are some of the leading indicators that may suggest you're on the right foot, and presenting those to decision makers when it comes to getting that buy-in from senior executives or budget controllers to invest in that idea. And that could be something like, something as simple as building some form of a landing page with an advertisement to start with, a few $100s. Let's get some leading indicators. What those leading indicators might be in this case could just be people signing up to our landing page, and what percentage of people that see this ad click on the ad, and then going from there, rather than selling it as this is how much money it's going to make before you've even done an hour of work.
Absolutely right. This is another thing that I would say drives me a little bit crazy. You'll have people inside large organizations who the way they try to sell their idea is they try to demonstrate it purely analytically. They do lots of research and they create 97-page PowerPoint documents with super detailed Excel spreadsheets and they promise big returns, but because they're a big risk, naturally their leaders say, we're not sure, can you go and study it some more, blah, 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 blah. It is far more effective to do what the startup companies do. Businesses are launched today with people spending $0. There are free tools available out there. You can go and design the landing page you described. That's not a hard thing to do. So you go and do the things that you can do without asking for anybody's approval. You go and generate some interesting data, and you go to leadership and you say, this is what I've done on my own, taking, by the way, no institutional risk and spending none of your money, and I've learned these interesting things. Wouldn't you like to learn more? That is just a total game changer of a conversation and the way that you should approach innovation inside large organizations. Of course, this requires leaders that are conditioned to hear that, et cetera, et cetera. But generally, the wouldn't you like to learn more conversations go far better than aren't you impressed by my analysis conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, and I like to call that black ops, where you just do it anyway and then present the findings. And it's like, hey, we actually built a functional prototype, or it may not even be a functional prototype, but it's like, we actually did this work and we've got 1,000 customers on our waiting list that have signed up for this, and it cost us $50. And that's obviously going to be a lot more compelling than 90 pages of research based on what happened in the past versus where we might go in the future.
And don't get me wrong, of course, doing your homework matters.
Yeah, of course.
Certainly analysis paralysis is a bad thing, but doing without thinking can be a really bad thing too. So, doing the right fundamental research to understand the customer and the job she's trying to get done and look at the competitive landscape and be inspired by analogies, blah, 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 blah. There's a lot of work that you should do, but you should also have the bias to action. So that is the balance that I think is really powerful when you are smart, thoughtful, and thorough as you go and approach innovation with a very clear bias to action to learn through execution, not just to learn by sitting at a desk reading.
Yeah, and will identifying those leading indicators and presenting them provide a layer of protection from having, say, the rug pulled out from underneath a team when they've received some funding to explore a particular idea, but then external conditions change, strategies change, priorities shift, and that project gets canned without any prior notice. Oftentimes we see this happen, and a lot of people I work with, this is one of their key grievances. They say, yeah, we got some funding to do this, but then within 3 months, it was canned because we weren't hitting revenue targets, we weren't making a profit. But if they are presenting some of those leading indicators that suggest growth and suggest that they are going in the right direction, I imagine that would help them form a case for continuing to work on those projects.
Absolutely agree. So if I go back to my MBA class with Clayton Christensen, I remember distinctly one of the cases he taught back in 2000 was a case about this guy, Nick Fiore, who was a corporate innovator in a bunch of advanced materials companies. And the punchline of the story is the clock always ticks. The clock always ticks, and at some point it hits midnight or equivalent, the alarm rings, and if you're not demonstrating results, the rug will be pulled out from under you. So that's the first reflection I have there. The second reflection is I think it's absolutely right. In the early days of an idea, it's very appropriate for the metrics to be learning, not earning oriented, where you do have the signposts, the proof points, the early indicators, et cetera. The third and final thing I'd say is that there is a little caveat to this where often people think because they're doing something innovative, results don't matter, and that is totally wrong. This is one of my co-author from Dual Transformation, Clark Gilbert's. This is one of his biggest pieces. He actually drove dual transformation at a newspaper company and then at a university. And one of his demands is that the people working on the B side of the equation, the new growth side of the equation, they have to deliver results because there's so much institutional skepticism that if they do not deliver results, they just have all the ammunition to kill them. So what he suggests that people do is be modest in your expectations in the early days and then over-deliver. The thing that gets you killed if you're a corporate innovator is if you promise, year one, we're going to earn $100 million of revenue. Okay, how many things have actually ever done that in history? None. Okay, well, that's going to be pretty hard. So again, more learning-oriented, set the bar low so it's easy to exceed, and recognize you got to then change the conversation with leadership because usually the only way that you get funding is if you promise these huge numbers. But if you're never going to deliver them, you're just setting yourself up for failure.
And I guess if you are proposing that you're going to make $100 million in your first year, then you're probably going to ask for $500,000 to $1 million at least to get started, which means you're going to have a team. You're probably going to have a steering committee associated with that. You're going to have very high expectations. And then if you fail, it's a massive failure, and you're probably, in some organizations, might get disciplined, and you're probably not going to try again. And also that sends a signal to everyone else that, hey, innovation's risky. Look what happened to Mr. X over there. Rather than, say, spending $1,000 to learn what you need to, like you said, learning indicators, not earning indicators to start with. And then if you fail, well, it was only $1,000 failure, and we can move on to something else.
Absolutely. IDEO says fail quickly, fail cheaply, right? And I think that's absolutely right. And that helps to change some of the stigmas around failure. When all the failures in your organization are big bets, yeah, of course, there's a stigma around failure. But you go and run a cheap experiment and learn from it, well, that's good, not bad, right? Anytime you do anything, you could learn that this isn't something we should do, and that's good learning. You can learn that we should only do this when. That's good learning. You've created a strategic option. Or you could say, oh, we shouldn't do this. We should do this instead. Those are all really good things. The less that you can spend and the more quickly that you can learn those things, the more of an organizational hero you'll be.
Makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense. And for the corporate entrepreneur who perhaps is in an organization that has entrenched values, senior management just aren't buying into things. They're just not wired that way. They're predisposed to perhaps having a red brain and avoiding risk and embracing certainty. And say you've been hustling and grinding away for 2 years. You're trying to get stuff done. Maybe you got some budget, but then the rug was pulled out from underneath you. Should you at some point just say, okay, I'm going to either go and work for another organization or start my own organization, or perhaps seek some funding to go out of the building and do it yourself, where that organization you're working for perhaps takes a small amount of equity in your business? I mean, obviously you can fight, but at some point, maybe the fighting turns to a bit of foolishness.
I remember an early experience at Innosight when I joined back in 2003, and there were all of 3 people as part of the organization. We had a conference, and this question came up, and somebody asked Clay Christensen. They said, my CEO doesn't understand disruptive innovation. I can see plainly that our industry is being disrupted. What should I do? And Clay said, quit. Because if your CEO doesn't get it, the odds that you're going to successfully overcome the dilemmas of disruption are very low. And I remember sitting in the audience during this discussion saying, that can't be right. That can't be the right answer. You got to be able to fight and overcome and all that. And I think certainly there are circumstances where you can find an ally on the leadership team and you can begin to change that. Or you can do as you suggested and say, hey, it will be better for the organization if you treat this off balance sheet or whatever as a separate investment. But I think in many cases, you just have to deal with the stark reality that there just isn't an imperative to change. And what will happen is that imperative will come when it's too late, when you are truly sitting on a burning platform, and the option is either to stand still and die or jump and pray. A poor option set, and you don't want to be somebody who's caught in that circumstance. So yeah, I think the unfortunate reality is there are some circumstances where you do suggest people get out while the getting's good.
Yeah, and I guess that aligns with something you said at your talk at Innovators Sydney, which was the most underutilized source of energy in the world isn't the sun, wind, or waves. It's our organizations and their people. And if you are that way inclined, where you want to solve problems, you want to create new value for the world, you want to experiment, you want to get out there and hustle and sell and do everything, but your organization just doesn't allow you to do that, then ultimately it is a waste of human potential.
No, absolutely agree. And I am an optimist at the end of all of this. And, it's not easy in this field to be optimistic. You've got Christensen's book in the 90s was The Innovator's Dilemma. You go back to the 80s, Dick Foster, one of my mentors, wrote The Attacker's Advantage. There's one of my former clients, Dave Ulmer, who I worked with in a couple organizations. He wrote a book a couple years ago called The Innovator's Extinction. So, there's lots of ground for pessimism. And certainly, you see large organizations that stumble and do silly things and crush the entrepreneurial spirit that exists within. But you also see examples of large organizations that overcome these dilemmas, that figure out how to channel and harness the energy that lies within. And it's possible. So, we hope, of course, the ideas that we put out there and the work we do with organizations help more organizations do it, because when you see it, it's a really beautiful thing.
Yeah, and it is definitely a very beautiful thing when it does happen. And I guess one thing that stands in the way, and we touched on this earlier, was that authoritarianism. And just on that point, I mean, I would love for you to recount a story you told during your talk about one of your sons, Happy Harry, and a little playground incident.
Yeah, it's a reminder of what it is that constrains the natural human creativity. So this is my now 7-year-old boy, Harry, lovable goofball. His father, me, was born in America. His mother, my wife, Joanne, was born in England. You ask Harry where he's from, even though he has those parents and was born in Singapore, he's likely to respond that he's from Mars. You know, that's the type of kid he is. Happy Harry is his nickname at school. So, you know, we were surprised a couple years ago when we got a letter from our condo association describing an incident involving Harry. And the letter described how Harry was caught on CCTV defacing the basketball court in our condo with quote unquote some materials. Vandalism is unacceptable, the letter went on. Fortunately, our cleaners managed to remove it, or you would have been fined. And, of course, what was Harry doing? It was a Sunday afternoon. He and the other kids were bored. They said they wanted to go and take some chalk and draw a baseball pitch down on the basketball court. Not only did I say that was fine, if you look at the CCTV footage, which they sent us pictures of, you can see a blurry outline of me because I'm there with them. And the cleaners didn't remove the chalk. It was the rain. It rains every day in Singapore, so this is not a surprise. So, you know, poor Harry, he looks at this and he says, am I not supposed to do this? Am I not supposed to be creative? Am I not supposed to play? And this is kind of a click moment for me. This is what happens. You enter the world like Harry, curious and creative, and then you get slapped on your wrist when you express that. You go to school and you learn there's a right and wrong answer. You go to an organization, you learn there is a right and wrong way to do things, and you get conditioned to conform. So this means the greatest challenge that we face inside organizations stares us back in the mirror every day. It is an institutionalized inertia that borders on an addiction to business as usual. There are happy Harrys amongst those organizations, but they are constrained and contained by all the things that help the organization execute today's business, but inhibit its ability to create tomorrow's business.
Yeah, and I guess Singapore as a country is perhaps a microcosm of that in terms of the broader theme here. I mean, how do you see things playing out in Singapore? I mean, you've been there for about 8 years now. Obviously, Singapore made its wealth on the financial markets. It's, from what I understand, the fourth biggest financial hub in the world behind Hong Kong, New York, and London. But now a lot of departments and government agencies setting up funds. I know Maritime Singapore set up what was, I believe, $1 billion fund, and there's numerous multi-$100 million funds being set up to support and seed innovation, technology, startups, and so on. But money is one thing. Mindset and the way you approach solving problems is another. So despite the government's best efforts to support innovation, I mean, how do you see that playing out on the ground in Singapore?
Yeah, it's a great question. And if you've got an hour, we can go through all the different ways you might explore it. I won't spend an hour, Steve, don't worry. But I'll give just a couple reflections. You know, one of the things I just really appreciate living in Singapore is how thoughtful and thorough the government is about things like this. So it knows if it is truly to develop an innovation or entrepreneurial ecosystem, it cannot simply throw money at the problem. There's some soft things it has to do, like when you get a unicorn that is homegrown, like a Grab, or you get a hot growing startup like Carousel, you got to go and highlight it. And you got to make heroes out of the people who do it, so that the parents will look at the children and say, it's not just going to work for one of the big banks. Being an entrepreneur is actually a good thing to do. You have to go and look at the school system. You know, the Singapore school system is amazing in terms of churning out graduates that do really well on PISA exams and so on. But Singapore knows that its curriculum will stifle creativity. So it's working on changing the fundamental curriculum. It's also created places inside Singapore that are legitimate entrepreneurial hotspots. Block 71 has more startups per square foot than I think any place in the world. So it's a multi-front effort to go and address this, working with startups, working with large companies, government agencies are involved, et cetera. I've seen a lot of progress in 8.5 years here. I see a lot of things that still need to be worked on. You know, Singapore, its organizations are really good at disciplined execution, as good as anything in the world, and all the things that we talked about really run counter to that. So there is still a mindset shift that is required among the leaders of many organizations here. You have examples. I talked about DBS before. SingTel is another good example example of a large locally based organization that's done a lot of good things. So you have some proof points, but we certainly need to see more as Singapore is going to continue to drive growth and productivity in the years ahead. But I think it is a qualified success story to date.
Yeah,
in
definitely.
Innovation and entrepreneurialism, that is.
Yeah.
Unqualified success story in other areas. I'm looking at out my window at reclaimed land that has these amazing buildings on top of it. When you think that 50 some years ago, this was a fishing village, it is just an unbelievable story.
Well, it's remarkable how far Singapore has come. And from what I understand, the British left. Malaysia didn't want anything to do with Singapore. It was effectively left on its own to perish. And now look at it, it's come so far and for a population today of 5.5 million people, and obviously much lower over the decades, it's an incredible success story. And I think there's so many lessons that people can take out of Singapore that you can apply in various contexts.
Absolutely. One big one that people often miss is just being very practical and borrowing other people's ideas. I think a mistake that people make is they think that they've got to do something that no one else in the world has ever thought of before. I always remind people, as many do, of the Pablo Picasso quote, "Good artists copy, great artists steal." And the founder of modern Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, this is what he did. I mean, not literal theft. That happens in other Asian geographies. Corruption is very low here. But going to say, okay, who has come up with a good solution globally? Okay, we see this here. Let's go and apply it in the Singapore context. So we don't have to invent everything. We can smartly copy and smartly apply things in our context. And of course, we don't want to blindly do this. We want to appropriately modify it for what makes sense for Singapore and its place in the world. But just a real practicality of looking externally, getting stimuli, and brilliantly borrowing ideas, which, again, anybody can do that. You don't have to be Lee Kuan Yew to go and do that. Anyone can do the same thing that he did.
Yeah, well said, well said. Scott, time for a Peter Thiel-inspired question. What's one thing that everybody believes in the corporate innovation space that you don't agree with?
One thing that everybody believes that I don't agree with, well, we mentioned it before. So I think the lean startup movement has gone in some places too far. So I think there are many people, maybe not everybody, but many people in the corporate innovation space that say the answer is minimum viable product, go and test, go and learn, and they're skipping steps. So they're not taking the time up front to go and smartly look at the market, go and analyze what they're trying to do, blah, 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 blah. So I think a widespread belief is that there is no value in thinking, and I think that is pretty wrong. Yeah. So that is one thing that I think the majority agree with that I do not.
Yeah, even within the startup ecosystem, I think you're starting to see some pushback on this. I had Rand Fishkin on the show, the founder of Moz, and he was basically talking about the MVP hangover, where especially if you're a startup and you haven't got the brand capital of a large organization, you take something to market, you may be taking something to market in a relatively small market. Say you're selling to commercial real estate investment trusts, and there's only 11 in your country, and you'll release a product to market. You email all of the potential target customers at these organizations. It's a piece of crap. They never get back to you because of it. And then you want to go back to them, say, a few months down the line and say, hey, remember me? I had that product a few months ago. We're a little bit better now, but by that point, it's too late. And people don't want anything to do with you. So there are a lot of risks with taking an MVP to market prematurely.
Absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. And, even Steve Blank, so if you trace the lineage, Eric Ries gets a lot of the public credit. But, Steve Blank is kind of the intellectual godfather of the ideas in the lean startup. Steve Blank has recently commented that the idea of the lean startup works when capital is scarce. So when capital is scarce, then this is a smart way to learn. When capital is abundant, then perhaps we shouldn't be quite so lean. So again, the idea of removing waste and being smart about how you spend your money, I think it's hard to disagree with, but I think sometimes people just take it too far. It's like anything, it's just any idea taken to extremes has its downsides. And I think the smart innovator goes and looks at lots of different schools of thinking and says, all right, what makes sense for me in my particular circumstance? And doesn't just blindly follow a particular gospel, because blind following of gospel almost always leads you to trouble.
Yeah. And taking Ben Horowitz's, it's Mark Andreessen who says, always maintain strong opinions weekly. So always challenge your opinion. Doesn't matter how strong you may have believed in it in the past. Things change, and you should always ask yourself, why may this not apply in this case? And that could be that why may an MVP not apply in this particular case? Or there's so many different ways to approach problems these days that to blindly do the same thing over and over and over is in fact insanity.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Strong positions weakly held, I think, is a mark of leadership through uncertainty. Is, you cannot know for sure. And this is, I think, the fundamental challenge facing many top leaders today, because, top leaders got to their position through good, disciplined execution of known and proven business models. And you then say, well, congratulations, your reward for that is the skills that got you to this point are now no longer useful. And you have to develop different muscles and different mindsets. Yeah. But that's the world today.
That's the game. What got you here won't get you there. So thank you so much for your time, Scott. You've left our listeners with a wealth of value bombs. But before we wrap up, I can't let you go without kicking off our 3-question lightning round. Are you ready to rock and roll?
I am.
Question number 1, Scott. And I don't know how you'll answer this one because you've been at Innosight now for almost 2 decades. But the question is, if you could work for any organization at any stage of the company lifecycle, who would it be and why?
Well, I would say that I would not redo history. So the ability to participate in our organization in its early days, I cannot imagine for me as a person as something that I would draw more utility from. Just given the industry, the other moment in time that you would love to be at is the Boston Consulting Group in its early days when Bruce Henderson is there, and they're coming out with a lot of their formative ideas about the learning curve and so on. The thing that I personally get attracted to is being in that fermented soup or whatever, where there's a bunch of mysteries and you don't know the answers to the mysteries. So you come up with a hypothesis, you go and try it, you go and learn from it, you try it in other places, and then you synthesize what emerges out of it. And Innosight in its early days, and still today, by the way, was replete with mysteries. And BCG, I think, in its early days was a mystery hunting organization. And my brain, at least, really likes looking for mysteries and trying to solve them.
So just on that, Scott, you've been, like I said, you've been in the space for a while now, but once you get past that initial point where everything's novel, it's replete with mystery, as you said, where does your ongoing energy and enthusiasm for the space come from?
Yeah, well, it comes in 2 areas. Number one, as you have solved the mysteries, you say, okay, this is known and proven, so just go and do this. Mm-hmm. And trying to proselytize and spread ideas around disciplines of innovation, structures at work, et cetera. That's one part. And then the second part is anytime you solve one mystery, another one emerges. So if you look at our history, if you make it really brief, the first mystery we tried to solve is disruptive change. And then you try to say more broadly innovation processes and practices. And then you say more broadly strategy through uncertainty. And I think we've got pretty good answers to those 3 categories of things. But you now have a 4th category of mystery related to leadership and organizational culture. So we haven't conclusively solved the first 3. Those are big, complicated problems. We still have things to do there. And we have a whole other set of things to work on. So I can very easily see another 15 years still puzzling through all this stuff. And, you get closer to truth, but do you ever truly get to truth? Who knows?
Well, I guess you only ever get to more right, but truth is all subjective and based on the evidence that we have at our disposal, right? It's the whole black swan philosophy. But moving on to question number 2, Scott, if you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, who would it be and what would you ask?
Anyone a question, dead or alive, who would it be and who would you ask? This is, by the way, a known and proven technique. When you don't have an answer to a question, you repeat the question so you can buy your brain time to go and answer the question. Well, I think if you look at our world, right, our world focuses on how leaders respond to disruptive change. Mm-hmm. And we try to surmise based on the historical record why people did the things that they did. So what I would love, you could pick many of them, but you pick any leader that confronted a disruptive change. Western Union back in 1876, passing on buying Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, all the way forward to Steve Jobs making decisions around what he was doing at Apple. And you would love to know, did they do the things that you think that they did for the reasons you think that they did? Mm. And again, you could put probably 50 different people there. You can point to IBM making its proclamations about whatever. We know all the stories. But what you'd really love to do is be there in the moment to see whether the hypotheses that you had about the forces at work that led to the decisions decisions are right. Again, we can't know unless we're sitting in the room with people.
Yeah, we tend to conflate the outcome with the decision quality, but oftentimes there is an element of luck, and the outcome may not necessarily be the one that was desired, but it just happened to be positive.
No, and survivor bias and the inverse of survivor bias, so we go and reconstruct history, and we do the best that we can. Yep. And one of the things that I loved about Christensen's work, you go back to his original book, The Innovator's Dilemma. I mean, this is based on really deep, proper academic research. I mean, this is not made up mumbo jumbo. And there have been a bunch of other academics that have then commented on and further enhanced, and in some cases criticized and changed the underlying body of work. But it's real stuff. So but still, it's an academic theory that's based on the best evidence that you have, and you just love to have better evidence.
Exactly. And lucky last, Scott. Apart from embracing new challenges, which you derive a sense of energy and enthusiasm from, what else do you do to stay on top of your game? Because other than being the MD of Innosight over in Asia Pac, I mean, you've published a handful of books over the years, and obviously a preeminent name in the space of corporate innovation, keynote speaker, and so on. I mean, what do you do to stay on top of your game? You've got 4 kids at home as well, who I'm sure keep you very busy, but despite that, you're still kicking goals in this space. So do you have any rituals or routines to keep churning out high quality work?
Well, I would say the thing that if you ask me what I'm proudest of, which relates to this, I am proudest of the way that I have managed to integrate my professional life and my personal life, because my kids are the endless source of inspiration for me, which means spending time with them and doing things when I am quote unquote working actually intersect. I learn from my kids. They teach me new ideas. They help me push my frontier of thinking around things. Harry, our 7-year-old, he's so, he's in that high curiosity phase. So the questions he asks are great questions, and answering them helps me. And, my daughter, my 10-year-old daughter, Holly, she's in an entrepreneurial contest where she and a classmate are working on an idea, and I'm making sure that it is their work and not my work, but drawing inspiration from that, finding ways to just see what the kids are doing and learn from it, and see how they're interacting and learn from it. That's where I draw a lot of my energy, and it exposes new avenues for thinking. So that to me is the number one thing. So the answer is have lots of kids and spend time with them.
Fantastic. Beautifully said, Scott. So our audience can find out more about you and your work over at Innosight.com. They can hit you up on Twitter at Scott D. Anthony. They can read many of your articles over at hbr.org, and of course, pick up your books, most recently Dual Transformation, as you alluded to during our chat, along with some of your other best-selling books, such as The Little Black Book of Innovation, over at Amazon.com. Is there anything else they should be looking up online, Scott?
No, you covered all the bases, Steve. Thank you very much for all the great questions. This was a really fun discussion.
No, likewise, really enjoyed your insights. Obviously coming from a lengthy time in the space, a space that is, in my opinion, awash with charlatans. So it's always really great to connect with someone like yourself who has, battle scars to show for your time in the field. And I think the insights you brought to the show today really reflected that. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Hi guys, Steve again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to receive a weekly email from me, complete with reflections, books I've been reading, words of wisdom, and access to blogs, ebooks, and more that I'm publishing on a regular basis, just leave your details at futuresquared.xyz/subscribe and you'll receive the very next one. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, take a minute to like, share, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It goes a long way to giving the podcast the exposure it needs so I can continue bringing you guests and conversations of the highest caliber. You can catch me on Twitter at Steve Gliveski and on Instagram at TheSteveGliveski. Until next time.
Hasta la vista, baby.